The scam in this case focused on timeshare ownership.
I have a buyer who wants to buy your timeshare, but in order to close the deal, you're gonna have to pay different upfront costs.
This is just one-time payment, but then they would come back and be like, I promise you this is last time.
Things can kind of spiral after that.
I saw him in court. I basically told him to go to hell.
It breaks my heart for what I put her through. I saw my whole life savings go out the door.
At this point, I don't think any of the victims will see any of that money.
The judgment that God's gonna put on them for what they done to me is gonna be horrible.
The advent of timeshares was sizzling, and they were new and fresh and family-oriented. The sales industry boomed.
Own a timeshare, turn it into cash.
Timeshares only sold our timeshare fast and for the price we wanted.
And they gave us a $1,000 shopping spree.
Introducing the Timeshares Only $1,000 shopping spree bonus. Call now.
They were initially attractive because of their cost and because of the location and the opportunity. So we'll take Walt Disney World, for example. You would pay probably $4,000 or $5,000 to rent a decent hotel room or a suite large enough for your family for $600 a year. You could do it every year. But kids grow up, and suddenly the enchantment that was so strong begins to wane.
Once you own one, the fees sort of never stop, and they're difficult at times to sell or to get rid of.
The unfortunate reality of a timeshare ownership, you can't just walk away. Your credit, your status, your reputation is at stake if you don't pay what you owe. And when you buy into a timeshare community, you sign a promise and a covenant to pay your share until either the timeshare comes to an end, which doesn't happen, or else you sell it. And of course, with the market saturated with sales, people increasingly became desperate to offload them.
Right down the street is Orlando, one of the largest timeshare attraction areas probably in the world. In this geographical area, you sort of had the perfect storm, if you will, of individuals and the local area where there are a lot of timeshares. This case involves, at its simplest form, timeshare ownership and timeshare sales. We have a number of individuals who own timeshares, one or several, that are looking to get rid of said timeshare for one reason or another, whether it be financial, health, just sick and tired of it, whatever it might be. You have a number of individuals who sort of preyed on that point.
The group that was involved in this scam were a group of people who used to work for timeshare companies or companies that sell timeshares. When they became unemployed, they decided they can do this on their own, and by purchasing lead lists from each other and stealing lead lists from these companies.
They took this list of individuals and they represented to them that they had buyers for their timeshare. And therefore, in order for this sale to go down and it to be successful, they needed to pay some sort of fee.
The very first call, you have to remember, is just that call that's like, I have a buyer for you, and all you have to do is pay $480. And it's reimbursable. You'll get it back once the sale comes through. All you gotta do is pay that $480, and then you'll finally offload this property you've been trying to sell.
This is just one-time payment, but then they would come back and be like, you know what? I promise you this is last time, one more time.
Once you put a little bit of money in, you tell yourself, well, I don't want to lose that $480, so I may as well pay another $480, and then I'll get my buyer. And then they come back again and you say, well, I don't want to lose that $1,000, so I'll just put another little bit in, and then I'll get it all back.
The Bureau became involved in around 2017 along with St. Petersburg Police Department and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. The scheme was essentially situated with sort of two classes of subjects. The first being what we called were callers, the second being runners. The callers were the individuals who were actually on the phone contacting the individuals that were looking to sell their timeshares. They were the ones that were telling them that they had a buyer. Not true. They were the ones that told them that they had to pay certain fees in order for this timeshare sale to materialize. Not true. And they were the ones that were able to get and induce those victims to actually send the money to the second part of this scam, which were to the runners.
We call them the runners because they're instructed to go and get the money.
One of the reasons that we use money mules is that I don't want my face and my identity linked with a particular transaction. So when you go to MoneyGram and you pick up a certain amount of money, you have to give them your ID. And they're gonna write that ID down and they're gonna write your license number down or whatever. And so then you're connected to that. Or if you go to an ATM and you're pulling out cash, you're gonna get a photograph. Obviously, if you're sort of the top dog, you don't wanna be linked in that way. But you've gotta find people who are willing to take that risk for what is probably a relatively small amount of money because they're getting a low cut.
The callers had the victims send the money to wire transmitter services, and they would feed them a story.
I have a buyer now who wants to buy your timeshare. And so they're excited, right? There's a buyer. But in order to kind of close the deal, you're gonna have to pay different upfront costs. So sometimes there were like clerk of court costs or the typical kinds of costs that you actually do see when you're buying a piece of residential property.
Hey, Fred, this is David. Raina got the message from the folks down there in Miami. Your documents are back out of Mexico, so congratulations. By the end of the week, they're going to release your payment. Do return my call as soon as you can. I'll be in the office late, all this week. But congratulations. That was the hardest button to button there. We're getting the documents back from Mexico, of course, which, go figure. If you would, go ahead and give me a call as soon as you get this message. We can get this thing wrapped up, and I can send the bank my bill for your file. Thank you very much.
Scammers would use the pressure where they would say, hey, I have the money, I can send it to you within a day or two, which was very tempting for these victims because they really want to get rid of these timeshares and there's this money sitting that needs to be deposited into their account.
You're going to send this money to my courier or to my employee or whatever story they would provide them. And then those runners would actually go pick up the money, keep a little bit for themselves, and kick the rest of it back to the callers.
These runners were basically people who were drug addicts. They were homeless.
Those bottom levels tend to be, you look for the people you can take advantage of to make a relatively small amount of money for doing a very important part that kind of keeps you away from being the face of the problem. The callers were kind of this group of people at the top who were very loosely organized. They largely had kind of their own lists. Periodically, we'd see a message where somebody would offer to sell a list to another one, but anyone would take their victim kind of as far as they could go and then pass it off to the other guy. And once passed off to the other guy, he would just take it as far as he could go. And because there were, if I recall correctly, like 5 or 6 callers, they had a decent number of people that they could pass victims around to who would kind of come in with a new but related story.
Probably one of the most heart-wrenching for the investigators, certainly, and obviously the victims portion of the scam is when it sort of transitioned to this second phase. Some of these victims were actually contacted by now a separate fake attorney, real attorney in that the name actually exists and it really is an attorney, but this person has stolen their identity. They are now being told that we are really sorry to tell you, but that money that you had sent for the timeshare sale that you thought was going to go through, sometimes a few $100s, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars, was actually fake. You were scammed in sending that. There's a case going on. Those individuals have been reported to law enforcement. That was all for naught. You sent that money in vain. I am an attorney. I specialize in this sort of legal world, and I am going to represent you going forward. We're going to get your money back.
But of course, you have to pay court costs. And so once it entered into that second stage of the scam, when they're paying court costs, it got astronomically higher.
And as such, these people were re-victimized.
Any amount of money that anyone loses is substantial, but the people who really lost the most money kind of got caught on that second side of the scam.
We had a particular group of about 5 individuals that once this portion of the scam happened, were re-victimized to the tunes of hundreds of thousands of dollars collectively.
The timeshare scam works simply because people are so trusting. If you have a timeshare that has been on the market for a long period of time, you've not been able to sell it, not many interested parties, you're very susceptible because you're eager. So when someone contacts you and says, I have an interested buyer, but there's some fees that they're expecting you to pay, but then they'll pay the cost of the timeshare. I mean, you're in. So if I claim to be a real estate agent and they look up me and find out, oh, yes, he is a real estate agent, they may not notice that the website I've sent them to or that the phone number given is off by a digit or the email address I'm using is off by 1 letter. And that kind of fraud is easy for someone to miss. They start to communicate with the person, never once thinking, let's meet in person or let's have a video chat just so I can feel safe and comfortable with this. They're all in because now they have a buyer. And all I have to do is pay these fees. But, oh, and there's now these other fees that I wasn't expecting? All right, I'll pay those, but then we're done, right?
Approximately 2017, I started to get a couple calls from the St. Petersburg Police Department, basically asking us to run some checks, some database checks, some things like that. An attorney in the area, David Eaton, who was making complaints that his name and likeness was being used for a fraud scam involving timeshares.
My victimization all began when I got a phone call, oddly, from a friend of mine who was employed with the Florida Bar. Part of his responsibility was to take in complaint calls from victims of shady lawyers. And so my name came up in the context of a shady timeshare scam. So this gentleman, who happened to know me from his tenure as a practicing lawyer in St. Petersburg, just called me up as a friend and out of professional courtesy to say, you're not the subject of any investigation, but I thought you just might like to know someone, I don't know who, is pretending to be you and scamming the public.
They would use the names of real attorneys that were local to the area and just plop their names into Gmail. And so if the individual Googled them, they would see an attorney that did real estate work in Orlando.
99% of the victims didn't call me to verify I'm the David Eaton that they're actually sending their money to. They looked me up on the internet. Yes, he's in St. Petersburg, but I have his cell phone number, so he's got to be legitimate. My landline is what's registered on the internet. So they wired the money to the dirtbag, right? And then he disappears. So now they're going back to David Eaton. That's when they place the call. So they dial my number. I took a lot of phone calls from a lot of irate souls after they had become victimized, and literally spent dozens of hours listening to victims vent, trying to console them to what degree I possibly could. And since I knew that the police department was working on our behalf to catch this guy, I was inspired.
Most victims did not file police reports because they were embarrassed. Having Mr. Eaton come and tell us about what happened to him was what actually made this case possible.
Eaton Law?
Hi, Mr. Eaton.
Yes?
Hi, my name is Helena Myers. My father, Fred Platt, spoke with you earlier.
Okay, very well. Yes, ma'am. And Fred Platt is the Mexico, the Royal Sunset. That's correct.
Yes, yep, over in Cancun. So I went over to Walmart and we got that money sent over to you.
Well, it was you sent it to Mr. Boring, did you not?
Oh, yes. That was the
Okay.
name my dad had written down.
And you made sure that it was a private transaction, let him know that Mr. Boring is, because the way that you handle the protocols there at this particular in this particular system, it just requires a little bit of a finagling.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Go ahead with the. You should have some type of reference or transfer number or something like that.
Yeah, they actually highlighted it for me because I'd never done it. So.
Oh, okay.
All right.
Go ahead.
We were able to identify about 700 victims. They were from all over the country. They all had some sort of timeshare property or properties, as well as a small percentage of them had some vacant property.
All of our victims were over the age of 55. Good number of them were between 70 and 80. So something they had in common were they were older generation and they were not as familiar with technology like the younger generation was.
Mr. Cato was one of those individuals who was re-victimized and really thought the entire time that he was going after the real bad guys and he had the new good guy in his corner, when effectively they were all bad guys and they were all scamming him out of his money.
I've been married 59 years. It breaks my heart for what I put her through. The guy that first called me, he called me and said, hey, you're owed $30,000. I can get it for you. And I said, what are you talking about? Well, they sold one of your timeshares and the bank has the money, but they can't clear it because they don't have the title to the land. And if we can get the title to the land, then we can clear it. And I said, I don't have none of those papers. He said, don't worry about it. You give me $1,500 and I can get it. Sometimes they wait a week. Sometimes they call me 3 weeks later. But towards the end, it was like a game every week. They would call you or they would text you. If you didn't answer the phone, they'd text you. They'd wear your phone out. And yes, it was pressure. I kept stealing from my business to pay them. I was trying to get money from anywhere. It's like a disease. It's like you're hooked on drugs. You can't get off of it. It's that high, and then they come, oh man, we're gonna get our money. Sometimes they send me to a title company. That's what it was. One was in Clarksville, Texas. I went all the way over there. The building was abandoned. They sent me to a bank in Dallas, to a certain person. He wasn't there. They ain't never heard that person. And I called back, man, what are y'all trying to do to me? Well, I talked to this guy on the phone. And they just lied to us. I wouldn't let go. My wife wanted to back out a long time before I did. And I should have. I ruined us financially. I saw my whole life savings go out the door.
My job was to contact the victims and locate them. It was very difficult to have them believe me, especially with me having a foreign name and an accent. So when I contacted Mr. Cato, he was very suspicious of me. One of the tactics scammers used was to isolate their victims. They would basically tell them, hey, don't trust them, trust me. I am the attorney. I am going to help you. They were told when I called that I am fake law enforcement. So they believed the attorney, whom they looked up online and saw that he is real. I don't have a website with my name on it to where they can look it up and see that I'm real. Yes, they can call the police department, but they have this real attorney telling them she is fake. Mr. Cato briefly spoke with me. He told me that he had 2 timeshares, but those timeshares were sold by scammers and he did not receive any money. So as a result, he was contacted by an attorney from Orlando, Richard Hornsby, and this attorney was prosecuting the scammers who scammed him out of his timeshare. Well, when I explained to Mr. Cato that Richard Hornsby is possibly another scammer trying to scam him even more, he wouldn't talk to me. He told me, I'm busy. He found excuses. I can't talk to you right now. Now, FDLE agent Patty Thompson and myself drove to Orlando and we met with Richard Hornsby. And we verified that he was not working any timeshare-related cases, which kind of confirmed our suspicion of somebody using his name. When we came back, I called Mr. Cato's family. They had a suspicion that their dad was being scammed. They tried to make him realize, which by that time he sent a lot of money. He was very deep into this scam. He was continuing to send money and he believed Richard Hornsby. So after a couple of months, Mr. Cato, unfortunately, he lost his business. He lost his home, contact with his kids because of the scam. He did call me. He called me and he basically told me that he has been scammed since 2011. And this was 2017 when I made contact with him. So he's been scammed for a good number of years.
The most emotional aspect of my consultations with the victims was the silence. When they heard my voice, when they understood that I was wholly innocent, and they came to realize, if I had only called you before.
Because of this scam and because of the money he lost, Mr. Cato, who I believe has just turned 80 years old, is still working. He drives prescriptions around and delivering them to individuals. He is not able to enjoy the life that he built for he and his family. And that's heart-wrenching.
He's lost at least $500,000.
I beat myself in the ground. How could you be so stupid? I actually prayed for him. And I forgave him. Because the judgment that God's going to put on them for what they done to me is going to be horrible. Detective Merrick became my best friend. She pulled me up out of the pits. I couldn't have done it without her. And when I finally realized that what I'd done, she contacted the Texas Department of Public Safety and the Texas Rangers, and they came and they took my phone and they took my computer and they took everything out of it. And they sent it to her and built the case along with receipts from those. Man, you know how many receipts that is for $500,000? It was a box about that big.
Victims kept great notes. Some of the victims had spreadsheets of where every single dollar went.
Every conversation that they had with these individuals and what was said and the date and how much they sent, which was invaluable for a variety of reasons.
This case was just huge. We were finding more and more victims every day. We had the FBI involved at the point when we had close to 40 victims. These victims lived all over the United States. It's obviously something FBI usually handles. So once we decided that we needed help, we contacted Agent Jason Shern, who ended up assisting us in this case.
Our primary role was using all of those investigative tools in our toolbox. This included physical surveillance. This included subpoenas. We did a lot of telephone analysis to try to determine and to attribute phone calls to particular subjects, particular perpetrators, as well as victims.
Throughout this entire case, the goal was not even necessarily prosecute people. It was, how do we stop the people from making the calls?
Each of the callers sort of had their own niche in the scam. They, at times, were working together. They were sharing victims. They were assisting each other as what we would call a second voice. But they didn't always get along. They didn't always like each other. And so they were, at best, business partners in this scam. That meant that each of those individuals had sort of their population of victims.
So they used burner phones in this case, right? So they're phones that you can get cheap phones from a variety of companies, and you don't actually have to include your real name or whatever. But most phones still like ping off of towers, and so we had some ideas about who some of the individuals might be based on who the pickup people were and their relationships and kind of open source stuff. We were able to kind of gear in on individuals based on location data that showed like it cross-referenced with the person we kind of thought might be involved, and then laying that data on top of it and kind of like zeroing in. Now, that really only led us to the first individual, Mark Boring.
We actually conducted an undercover operation with him when we found a victim in Florida, Fred Platt, and Mr. Platt was contacted, like many other victims, by fake attorney David Eaton, and he was told that they had a buyer for his timeshare. He did send about $780 for the first payment that he was asked to do.
Eaton Law?
Yeah, David, Fred, we're getting ready to forward that money down to you.
Well, actually, which agent are you using?
Boring.
Okay. Make sure you use the system at Walmart then for that, okay?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, very well. Let me know when you concluded, okay?
All right.
After the first payment, Mr. Platt decided he's going to call David Eaton's office that he found a number for online. When he called Mr. Eaton, he found out that he was being scammed. At that point, he contacted our police department, and we decided to meet with Mr. Platt at his residence. We decided that because fake David Eaton asked him to send more money, we decided we're going to do an undercover phone call with the fake David Eaton, who was Mark Boring. And we told him that one of our detectives was Mr. Platt's daughter, and she was willing to assist her dad in sending this new payment that was requested of him.
Where are you located in relationship to here?
I'm actually over in St. Pete too. But,
cool.
Yeah, so I had no idea. I figured it was over here somewhere, Orlando, because he had given that 407 number, and I was like, oh, okay, that's fine, no problem.
Yeah, where in St. Pete are you?
Up on 9th Street.
My office is on 9th Street in 84th.
Get out. Oh, I don't live far from there at all. I live up in one of the apartment buildings.
Which
That's funny.
Yeah, that's strange. That is very funny. That's, well, you know, the world's getting
There's that small world complex that comes right back around.
Correct. Okay,
Oh, well.
very well.
At that point, when we sent the payment, we had UC units, undercover units, following Mr. Boring to a store where he picked up the money that was sent by undercover detective. We followed him home. We ended up doing a search warrant for his house, where we, the next day, went in and surprised him and found the payments for Mr. Platt and all the receipts related to Mr. Platt and other victims. When we conducted a search warrant at Mr. Boring's residence, he did not appear to be surprised. It was basically, well, it was about time for this to happen. Mr. Boring was facing scheme to defraud charges. He agreed to help us out by contacting other suspects and working undercover with us in order to bring other suspects to get arrested.
Hey.
Hey, what's going on?
What you got, lady?
I spoke with Cameron. I told him that I was from Luxury Condos here at Miami Beach Luxury Condos.
And I told him that you're the liaison department, that goes between the United States and Mexico.
That's what I told him. That's what we do.
Okay, good.
Because he asked me. So I gave him your name, Mark Boring. He's saying that he's going to run at 5 o'clock or at whatever time he needs to leave. But if he doesn't make it tomorrow morning, he'll withdraw the money, and tomorrow morning he'll call your number. I already told him that was the law firm, that he could reach Tom Ray or David Eaton, or I gave him my number for him to give me the reference number.
He was the easiest to find, frankly, of the group of people who were calling. From there, it was a spiral.
As we talked to each one of them, they would give us another suspect, and they would even work with us to get the other suspect arrested for something they did together.
Once we would take out, say, a Mark Boring, we effectively were able to take out that list of victims. The bleeding had effectively stopped for those individuals. But it continued, and there were additional callers. Those callers were continuing to call. We had to work as quickly as possible because every day we didn't, somebody else was sending money that we were probably not going to get back. We would love to just take it down as quickly as possible, but we figured in this instance, if we took them sort of individually rather than waiting till the end, we have at least stopped portions of it as we went along the rung.
Who picked up the money? If you have surveillance, gather the surveillance. So we would go to all these stores where the money was picked up, and we would obtain surveillance of the suspects picking up the money. In this case, it would be mostly runners. However, they would meet main suspects and the managers in the parking lot a lot of times, so we would have evidence of them meeting and handing the money over.
Myself and another detective from St. Petersburg, we would go and interview the runners, the people that were picking up money. Once we were able to gain some cooperation from those individuals, we then transitioned into more of a proactive approach, using those individuals and having them make phone calls or undercover transactions, things like that, to have them cooperate so that we could now go after the next guy in the rung, the next bad guy who was calling and victimizing people.
For several of these individuals, this wasn't like a supplemental income. This was the entirety of how they made their living for several years. And so there weren't a lot of like big flashy cars or nice watches in this instance. It was really, they were considering this their jobs. One individual in particular would go to the other individual's house and they would work a work day together, right? And so it was just spent as regular income. I wish that it was spent on a Ferrari that we could seize and sell, but in this instance, it wasn't.
We approached everybody with an opportunity to provide information, even if it be historical information. You have been caught, and you are in trouble, and you are going to plead guilty. Most of them said that right from the get-go. And the only way you minimize your potential incarceration duration is you need to cooperate with the government as much as possible. Some choose to do it, some don't. In this instance, we had pretty good luck, whether it be Mark or any of the other individuals that we went after. I think they understood that they were in trouble and that they needed to cooperate with us to sort of minimize that exposure that they would have, and they did so.
We had such solid evidence that we knew all these people are going to get convicted.
At the sentencing phase of all investigations, victims are welcome to come and speak in a public forum at the hearing.
Most of the victims lived out of state, and most of them are elderly, so they couldn't afford to travel. We still wanted the victims to be part of this trial. We had them write impact statements, and those impact statements were read in court in front of these defendants, so they know what they've done. Mr. Cato was actually at the trial.
When I was testifying against him, I was really honest with that judge. Let me tell you something, brother. I was mad. I was humiliated. I guess that's why they didn't let me stay in there. They walked me in, I testified, and they walked me out.
He told the judge, I think in at least 2 instances for 2 different individuals, and looked both of them in the eye and explained to him what this has done to him and his family, how he is not able to live the life that he was hoping to live in the later years of his life, how he has not been able to retire, how he continues to work. When somebody can actually come there and has the fortitude to stand in front of the individual who took their money and explain to them and the judge what that has meant to them, that's powerful.
I told him exactly how it affected my marriage, my wife. Man, for 2 years, it's like we were strangers because of this thing. I couldn't even face her. I hated to, because I had to have the money from her. She had to help me with the money, or we couldn't have done it. I went through my savings first, and then we went through hers. I lost my business. They shut the doors because I couldn't pay the rent. I told him how bad it was and how much he hurt me and my family, and what I did to my friends, how I destroyed relationships with this greedy thing, trying to get the money to support this habit. And that's what it was, a habit. Some of my friends I haven't talked to since. I can't. I feel ashamed.
We had David Eaton actually come and speak on his behalf of what this did to him, to his firm, how he was negatively impacted by these individuals, and especially Mark Boring, who is effectively stealing his identification and using his corporate standing and his legal standing to scam these people.
Well, he apologized outwardly and said he hadn't necessarily thought the degree of impact that his deeds would have. He thought it would just be basically taking a little bit of money from rich people who, could afford to lose it. He had already pled guilty, and I was brought into the sentencing hearing to speak both for myself and for the police as to the degree of victimization that I had suffered professionally. I generally keep my composure, but I was in an unfamiliar surrounding, and this had become quite personal, and I had invested, countless hours bearing the emotions of his actual victims. And so it became personal in that sense. When I saw him in court, I basically told him to go to hell.
Most of the scammers didn't have much reaction. I think 1 or 2 did cry, but most of the other ones just sat there and listened to what the victims had to say.
I do remember on a couple of instances, some remorse, but it's hard to forget the fact that these individuals were literally stealing money and making up entire scams to get them to part ways with their hard-earned money and preying on their vulnerability to do so. What you will hear a lot of times is, we didn't start this to scam people. It just sort of went that way. At some point, the money's too good, or you see a sort of an opportunity to scam people. These guys started this as a scam. None of this was legitimate. The only thing legitimate was the fact that we had real victims with a property that they were looking to sell. When they say they're sorry, I believe them. I just wish it didn't have to be that way, because we know what the real impact to these individuals were. Everybody's sentence varied, anywhere from probation to, I believe, Mr. Carefully, she received about 7 years.
I thought 7 years was pretty light. Yes. For all that money, for $2.2 million. He's probably out there right now.
At sentencing, AUSA Rachel Jones was able to say these individuals did not agree when, to cooperate when provided the original opportunity to do so. And then obviously the judge is the one who makes that sentencing decision. The thing that they did, though, is that although they didn't cooperate on the front end, did not plead guilty on the front end, they did plead guilty prior to trial. So they do get cooperation credit, and they did get cooperation credit, even though they didn't do that when we would have liked them to have done it, a year plus before.
The case was rock solid. It was a federal crime, and when you're dealing with the federal criminal system, you're in with the big boys. Yeah, on both sides.
There's only so much you can do to constantly protect yourself from people who are out there actively trying to scam you. The minute that we kind of think like that's never going to happen to me is a dangerous minute.
The reason this scam is so devastating is because it strikes at your sense of self-worth. We all take pride in our mindfulness, our awareness of what's going on around us. And so when someone who can hoodwink us in the name of a lawyer of all things is then able to extort not only our money, but our pride, it's almost the worst of all sins. It's hypocrisy at its fatalistic worst.
To be felt like you've been taken advantage of and that you can't trust anybody who is trying to talk to you, wants to sell you something, whatever it might be, that's a real impact in somebody's lives. And one of those things that's very difficult to sort of quantify.
Back in my day, we trusted folks. People were different then. We told somebody we're going to do something, we did it. There was morals. When somebody calls me now and they start asking for my social security number or my credit card number, I hang up the phone.
Victim education is probably the most central thing that we can do in order to teach people the tools of how to protect themselves or what to do.
Especially with elderly people or people who have almost like a gambling problem that can assist them and make them realize what they're doing is a scam. My guesstimate is that in this scam, approximately $4+ million was lost. At this point, I don't think any of the victims will see any of that money.